Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual home of Princeton Public Library here on Zoom. My name is Janie Herman, and I am the Adult Programming Manager at the Princeton Public Library. It's my distinct pleasure to host this evening's author event, where Maria Tatar will be in conversation with Jack Zipes, and they will be discussing the original Bambi, the story of a life in a forest, which is an illustrated translation of the classic written 100 years ago in German by Felix Salten. Before we begin, I would like to thank Jody Price of Princeton University Press for assistance with arranging the details for tonight, and Labyrinth Books for partnering with us and being our bookseller. If you would like to purchase the original Bambi by Jack Zipes, I'll be putting the link in the chat for you to order online from Labyrinth Books with a 10% discount code using the word Zipes at checkout. Please note that this event is being recorded, and our events typically go up on the library's YouTube channel within a few days. If you have friends or colleagues who could not make it tonight, let them know it has been recorded so they can check it out themselves. I'll now introduce our guests. I'll have them turn on their cameras while I'm introducing them so they can join us on screen. During their conversation, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, and they will be answered at the end of the conversation. So, Jack Zipes has written, translated, and edited dozens of books, including the original folk and fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm and The Sorcerer's Apprentice. He is Professor Emeritus of German and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. Maria Tatar is the John L. Loeb Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures and the Chair of the Committee on Degrees in Folklore and Mythology at Harvard University. Her research focuses on modern German culture, folklore, and children's literature. So I am so happy to have these two distinguished scholars with us here tonight for this book launch that we've been eagerly anticipating. So I'm going to turn off my camera and let Maria take it away.
Thank you. Thank you to the Princeton Public Library and also to the press, to the Princeton University Press for hosting this event. And welcome to all of you online for this evening of what I'm going to call Servine Delights. Servine is a new word for me too. It means of deer. And Jack, wonderful to see you. Thank you for bringing Bambi back unadulterated.
Thanks a lot, Maria. Thanks.
I was going to say Bambi unadulterated, but adulterated in a way. It's oriented toward an adult audience, undiluted, translated to be sure, but also importantly de-Disneyfied. And I was just astonished at how dark and enigmatic this text is. It's really one that makes you think more, think harder, not just about the animal kingdom, obviously, but also about the human condition as well, about humans as predators, as hunters. We are, after all, at the top of the food chain, but we're also environmentalists and stewards of the natural world. I have a ton of questions, and I just want to sort of preview them very briefly. I want to talk about depictions of violence in Bambi, this sort of dog-eat-dog world. Also how animals are our curved mirrors. They teach us things about us. And I would love to hear you say more about the allegorical qualities of the work, the way it looks forward to Nazi ideologies, but also looks backward to the violence of trench warfare in the First World War. But before we begin by digging into all of those tough, complicated questions, I have another tough, complicated question. But this one has to do with the translation. How did you get onto translating Bambi? And also, what were some of the challenges of translating this text? How did you capture a kind of Viennese vernacular in all its nuances, textures, shades, and tones? So can you start with that? Tell us something about how this began, how this project began.
Well, it was somewhat serendipity because I had not thought of ever that I would translate or retranslate Bambi. About 2 or 3 years ago at the Modern Language Association conference, 2 different editors came up to me, while socializing, and and both at different times said, how about, next year or 2 years in 2022, the book will be in the public domain. How would you like to translate Bambi? And I said to them, you're kidding, you're joking. Why would I want to do something like that? I had never read the book. I didn't even realize there was a
It's not on PhD reading lists, yes.
it was never on my list. And of course, I had seen the film a few times, but even then, I think it was about 30 or 40 years ago, or even longer, when I seen the film. So when I got home, I was somewhat annoyed that they would pester me, these two editors, and so I said, maybe something's there, and maybe I'm the dumb one and really should look into this. And so I began doing some research, and number one, I found out that Walt Disney was not the author of Bambi, that it was this man, Felix Salten, who was an Austrian Jew, and he had quite a history to him. And I was dazzled. I had yet to read the book itself. And it wasn't until that I did an amazing amount of research before I looked at the book. And then I realized that, and I read it in German this time, and I read and looked at Whitney Chambers' translation. I realized that there was a lot of work to do to try to get that vernacular, that as you know yourself, the Austrians love to be extra polite and exaggerate and have an unusual dialects. And so I decided that I would contact Anne Savarese, my editor, with whom I worked the last 20, 30 years at Princeton. I said, and I asked Anne whether she would be interested in me retranslate.
And she was horrified.
she said, what's happening to my friend? And so, but I managed to draw up a proposal, and she realized also that this could be a very unique book. And that's how it got started, the entire program. And I'm grateful to these editors whom I met, who sort of bugged me to a great extent. And I have learned a great deal, because not only did I read Bambi, but I read about 10 of his other novels. And not only, he also wrote a really brilliant, I think, fantasy novel that nobody has ever looked into. That too was translated by Whitney Chambers, and that's the Dog of Florence, which came out 2 years right after Bambi, and it's also worth looking at. I realized that Salten was a much more serious and unique type of writer. I mean, he wrote plays, he wrote poems, he was a great journalist, and so on. And he is someone who was not that well educated. He educated himself. So for me, it was also a learning experience, and I've learned not to sit on my high horse all the time.
Yes, and Salten, in addition to everything else that you described, he was a hunter who killed upwards a couple of hundred deer in his lifetime. Which reminds me that this is a work full of paradoxes, which is something I want to get to. But one more question about translation before we get on to violence and some of the other questions I raised. What was your process? Did you look at the other translators at all, or were you there with the naked text and work through it? Or can you say something about?
Yeah, in doing the research before I read the novel, and before I read it in English and in German. I came across a couple of essays that criticized the translation and said that Whitney Chambers was not a bad translator, but he really didn't capture, the mood, the ambience of Austrian German, because there's German and Austrian German,
Right.
so on and so forth, and so that's when. So my next step was to read the novel in German, and then read his translation, and there were certain passages and so on that had already been pointed out by these other really fine essayists. There's some very good essays about the book and about Felix Salten that I had not known until that time. So with that background, I think that I began translating with the intention of, because I've been in Vienna many times, and I spent 5 years teaching at the University of Munich in the south, which is very similar to Austria. I really had a knack, I think, for little things, just very little minor things, like the yapping of the bird at the beginning. That would be typical Austrian way that this magpie goes and won't stop talking, and that was typical in sort of cafes and so on. And so I tried to capture that as best I could.
Yeah. The charm of the language too, I think, comes through in your translation.
Well, thanks.
I mentioned earlier sort of animals as our curved mirrors, but I think also of what I think it's Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist, who tells us that animals are good to think with. As I was reading your wonderful translation, it dawned on me that animals are also terrible to think with. There are lots of things that happen in that. For us, there are, to be sure, utopian moments and moments of serenity, but it's also a place of darkness and terror. And maybe you can say something about that violence. And also, let's look backward for a moment to World War I, because I want to read you just a passage quickly, and then maybe you can respond to some of those questions that I just raised, where the wife of Hare, she's just like a soldier in the trenches of World War I. I had the feeling, this is 1923, 4 years after the armistice.
Right.
And there she is, she says, "Can you help me?" Bambi looked at her and shuddered. Her hind leg dangled lifelessly in the snow, dyeing it red and melting it with warm, oozing blood. "Can you help me a little?" And then she doesn't know what's happened to her. "I just can't seem to walk," she says. And in the middle of her words, she rolled over on her side and died. A chilling moment. So tell us about that sort of retrospective look, and then maybe also the prospect, how the novel also anticipates Nazi ideologies.
Right. Yeah, one of the things also I respected was the socio-historical background under which Salten wrote this novel. It's clear from a historical point of view that anybody, particularly if you were somewhat of an intellectual, it was clear how gruesome World War I was. But not only that, I mean, he knew a great deal as a journalist. He would cover reports, and he wasn't a soldier himself, but he knew exactly what was going on. And right after the war ended in 1919, immediately afterwards, many Jews were killed. They were killed because they were blamed for Germany and Austria losing the war. And so it was this, and there were assassinations. Many of the German and Austrian Jews were socialists or communists and so on. And so there was civil war for a while at the very beginning. So all this period, 1919 through the time his book was published, he was totally aware of the predicament of the Jews at that time, because they were bound to be killed, as I was,
Hunted down, yes, and killed, yeah.
oh, for sure. But the major case was in 1923, the same year that the book came out. Hugo Bettauer, also a brilliant Jewish Hungarian, published a book called The City Without Jews, Die Stadt ohne Juden. And that book came out and was a bestseller. It was a sarcastic depiction of what would happen to Vienna if the Jews left or were forced to leave. And I won't go into discussing that particular novel, but it's key because Salten knew him, Salten knew the book, and of course, we can trace an influence there, but I'm talking about the mood, the socio-historical background. 2 years, in 1925, after Bettauer published the book, he was assassinated. So this is the climate that was happening. And Salten, who's a very, much more of a brilliant writer than people realize, had all of this was coming at him from all sorts of angles. And we can't say for sure that he was going to make an allegorical sort of novel that depicts what's going to happen to the Jews or other minority groups. But for sure, he imbibed, I would say, all the events of his time, and it went into this novel, which is sort of a Bildungsroman. I think I mentioned one time in my introduction that Salten is Bambi, Bambi is Salten. And I think that's
yeah, what you say makes it so deeply culturally symptomatic. And as you're speaking, I flash back to moments in the text where you can see that the author's anxieties are sort of imprinted in the book, and it's deeply personal and autobiographical at the same time that it's sort of historical, socio-historical, and allegorical in a very big way. So I mean, it's a wonderfully layered text in that way, because when we think of, I think when I picked it up, I thought, oh, simple allegory about the animal world and all of that, but there's so much more to it than that. What about the way that it looks forward, the way that it prefigures the treatment of marginalized peoples, of persecuted peoples? How would you talk about that?
I tend not to sort of say that this is a novel only about Jews, but I think that the greatness of the novel is that it's about all refugees, minority groups, and so on, that he really catches, because he himself suffered from anti-Semitism and traveled quite a bit. He traveled widely in Europe. He also went to the United States once. He also went to Palestine.
What was he doing in the United States?
He was just curious and just decided to go with some friends over there to see what America was like. There is a very good biography that I refer to in the if people are interested in doing a study of that. Also, a friend of mine, Ruth Beckerman, who is a great filmmaker, right now is doing a film that concerns him because it's about this prostitute in Vienna, and there was a big, everybody has thought that Salten wrote this novel, and it was published with a pseudonym, and she has discovered that no, he was not part of that, and it's something totally different. So in Austria itself today, Salten is not or has never been a forgotten person. but he is noted, for really laying out what the difficulties were for minority groups, in particular the Jews. And we have to remember, this is a period of pogroms. This is a period when the world was radically changing. It's somewhat similar to what's going on in our world today. It's just amazing that there are parallels even today with the novel of Bambi and what is happening today.
Oh, yes, for sure. I mean, it's hyper relevant, I would say. There was also, I wondered if you could say something about the hierarchies that are set up in the animal kingdom. That is, I want to just dive a little bit more deeply into the text itself, because one of the things that I have to say bothered me is Bambi's reverence for the prince, who is his father.
Right.
And the first time he sees him, it's not just that he's in awe, but he's ecstatic. He feels this kind of ecstasy, like, who is this? And of course, you talked about a Bildungsroman.
Yes.
Kind of a novel of Erziehungsroman as well, a novel of education development, because he is going to become like his father. So you get this sort of circle of life, kind of, because the prince is getting old and gray by the end, and Bambi is going to replace it. So can you say something about the hierarchies in the animal kingdom?
Right.
And then maybe we can go from there to the gender story in Bambi. Yes. Because here again, there's a very clear demarcation between, say, Bambi's mother and Feline, and then Bambi, the prince, Gobo. I always forget the names of some of the minor deer.
Yes.
But can you start with that sort of hierarchy? And because the animals are not, it's not like they should become our models.
Right.
They're very much like humans in many ways.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Let me begin with the Disney film, which is atrocious, because at the beginning, there is a big difference between the film and the novel. And at the very beginning of the film, Bambi is worshipped. All the animals come, surround him, and are rejoicing and treat him like the prince already. And
Jesus, the Christ child.
Nobody, and it's a totally different beginning than the actual novel, in which just this magpie is there and says, "You've got it's so wonderful," and she can't keep her mouth shut and so on, so forth. But I think that what's interesting is it is never said outright that the old prince is his father. I mean, it's indicated, implied, and so on, but it seems that it is really follows the model of the Erziehungsroman or Bildungsroman, or whatever you want to call it, because he has to learn through this. Literally, the old prince sort of likes him and adopts him, so to speak, and
mentored him, as you point out in your introduction. Yeah,
right. And so that I think it is fascinating to see how he has to earn his way, by fighting, by growing horns, and taking charge of certain situations, so that he proves that he eventually does become, at the end of the novel, the sort of like the prince. He is the old prince has probably been killed or slaughtered or who knows, and he's all by himself. It's a very existential novel, and I love that chapter with the leaves. The leaves talking. It's just so moving about, what is life about? I mean, here, Salten really is asking the questions, like Camus or.
Well, and that's also the way the leaves are knowing but unknowing,
yes,
kind of. and I mean, it's almost like a defamiliarization,
Yes.
talking about death through these leaves, which kind of know and yet don't know, aren't quite as wise as humans are.
Right. Where are we going? What's going to happen when we start falling down? I mean, oh, it's
And
really
nobody's ever come back to tell
no,
us what.
no.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, so that's fascinating, because I think if you look at it in that way, the awe that Bambi feels is toned down a bit,
Yes.
but he becomes like the prince in a way. What about Feline and the mother,
Yeah.
and the way that, you know, once Bambi attains that regal status
Yeah.
of prince, and here's where I see some gender trouble in that he kind of he looks at Feline and she's getting kind of old, you know, and,
Right.
she's not, you know, quite as sprightly as she once was. So it's as if he's transcended the world of women and care and concern and all of
Yeah.
that to
Yeah.
become distant and majestic.
Yeah, no, definitely from a feminist point of view, there are certain incidents that really sort of show male supremacy, so to speak. But of course, you know, that's what their lives are like in the forest. And I don't think that, you know, I don't think that Salten really thought one way or the other. What he was a naturalist, as you pointed out before, Maria, that he loved animals. He always had about 3 or 4 dogs, and he had a reserve of his own in a forest. And though he hunted the animals, according to his daughter, he would never shoot an animal that he didn't eat, so to speak. And so that brought him, so to speak, closer to the animals. There was that chapter where the fox has to fight off the dog. And again, there's an attempt to deal with the sort of contradictions that Salten himself felt. And why was this dog working for the humans and not
the masters? Yes,
right, masters, right. And that's a breathtaking chapter too. Those 2 chapters are, I think, the 2 really key, well, I wouldn't say key chapters, but chapters that really affected me a great deal when, you know, when I was reading and also translating the book.
Oh, yes. This bifurcation of the animal kingdom into the domesticated animals.
Yes.
And the wild animals, the untamed animals, are totally contemptuous. You know, I'm thinking of Malcolm X.
Yes.
Remember house Negroes and field Negroes? I mean, that it sort of captures that binary.
Yes.
Yeah. So before we go, I wanted to ask you about some of the paradoxes. I mean, the strange fact that, you know, this is a book about the animal kingdom, and all these animals have language they can speak. And of course, it's written by a human being. So maybe we can get to some of that. But since you brought up the Disney film, I want to just put that on pause for a moment and ask about, I mean, you know, the famous trope of everyone's traumatized by the Disney film, the death of the mother and all of that. Can you say something about, you know, how Disney acquired the rights, and then also the impact? Because I understand that the film was not commercially successful at first. I mean, it must have made tons of money for Disney, but it wasn't a great success for a whole range of reasons.
Right.
But let's talk Disney for a moment.
Yeah, I think that there were a few critics who summed it up. I don't have their works in front of me right now, but the sweetness and the syrupy sweetness of Disney, with the song "We all love each other and love will descend upon us, and we will live a very good bourgeois life with many children. And all of this is just really, as soon as I had decided that I would take on this project, I looked at the film and I almost threw up. I mean, it really is so putridly sweet and so wrong in terms of what the forest is really like. I mean, what the great thing that I think Salten does is he demonstrates that living in a forest is lonely, that there's the solitude there, and the loneliness is overbearing. It's
in the struggle for survival. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the animals can't really help one another. You know, they pass running from the shooters. And I love the way that he set that. He never names human beings. It's Salten. It's he, him, using the pronouns and so on. And that makes it even more horrific.
Capitalized. The he is they become kind of deities in a way. Yeah. And yet, you know, there's that, remember that moment when Bambi realizes that animals and humans are not all that different? The distinction collapses.
Right.
And it collapses when he says, is it the prince who takes him to the dead body?
Mm-hmm.
And the realization that what humans and animals share is mortality.
Yes.
They're all destined to die. And, you know, it's kind of chilling to think that that's what links them, you know, that there should be some joy, some joyful feature that also links these two domains in these two spheres.
Yeah, what's overwhelmingly is this notion that certain groups of people in the world are born to die. They're born to die, and I think that we're seeing, we're seeing this actually, in the world today. What's happening with Russia, what's happening in the Ukraine, and so on. But not only those countries, but other countries, the rise of fascism that is going on. Salten, again, he was a very sensitive and intelligent man, despite all his contradictions. I mean, what he goes through in sort of changing his name and trying to deny, again, he's trying to make sure that he may not be killed. You know, if he kept the name Zygmunt Salzmann, that is a target, when you wear a name like that. And of course, that's one of the reasons he changed his name to Felix Salten, because it would make him less, let us say, less of a target than other Jews might be.
Yeah. What you said earlier just struck me, that, the fact that life sustains itself by killing and eating. And it's almost like, remember Joseph Campbell, who talks about the suffering in the world, and everything really is, as much as Joseph Campbell was such a spiritual guru, he had this view that, it's a dog eat dog, and that is the terror of the human condition,
Yes.
in a way. So he, him, and that abstract. Let's see, where were we now? Let's move on from Disney to some of these questions that I raised earlier about that. The strange fact. What about the relationship between humans and animals? Because what and these paradoxes. That here's Felix song. I mean, and I love the fact that his name Felix means happy, joyful. And he was adventurous and all of that, but he was also anxiety-ridden in a city that is known for addressing anxieties. What do you make of tell me about the relationship of humans to animals in this text? How do you how do you see the two? I mean, is the animal kingdom superior in the, or are they just different and coexisting, or is there some form of redemption for humans, or is there a way that they can find a middle ground or anything like, I'm thinking of just the bigger issues of the human animal binary, the contrast and how it's worked out through that novel. And in this strange way with animals who really are more human than animal. So maybe it doesn't get us very far in thinking about the human animal divide.
Right. Yeah, I think that basically, there are really no identifiable human beings. They're all anonymous killers, who are after these animals. So that for me, most of the animals, or all of the animals, are basically humans. In other words, they're human types of different kinds. They have their own characteristics, their own personalities. And I think that Salten was extremely clever in not bringing in this sort of making humans human. The humans are really monsters to a certain extent, and more human, as you put it before. The animals are more human than humane than humans are. There's a novelist her name is Dorothy Burroughs, from the 1920s and 30s and 40s, British, who her first job, she was a great artist after World War I, was to work with the zoo in London and to draw posters with the animals featured on them. And she won all sorts of prizes for 10 years, from 1920 to 1930. And after sort of drawing and depicting all these animals in cages or behind bars and so on, she got so sick and tired and critical of human beings, because why should we, the only way that these poor animals can live is by being encaged. And she refused, and she went on to write for children some amazing illustrated books. She refused to ever portray humans. It was always the animals who were living through problems that humans face, but basically she did not want to humanize humans because that couldn't be done. And to a certain extent, I think that that's what Salten does. There's no way that you can really justify, even though you have that scene with the dog, killing the fox and so on. There's no way you can really justify murder, and particularly murder where the opposition, or the people who, victims is the better word, when the victims don't have a chance really to live the lives that they want to live, which is also lives that, generally speaking, maybe they have some conflicts among one another and kill one another, but it's not really the purpose of their living.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it makes, there's a certain abstract quality to the humans. Of course, we only see hunters, right? Are there any?
Yes.
No other human figures in this novel.
No.
And there's a great moment where the animals are trying to figure out what's that third arm that he's got, and the third arm turns out to be the rifle, the weapon, the instrument of death, which is, part of the body of the, that is, it's almost as if humans have this deadly capacity built into them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the abstract quality, the fact that the he, him is always capitalized, as if they're sort of deities, as if these hunters are but they're these terrible terrible monsters really in the woods, and you never know when you're going to come across one of them.
Right.
So yeah, and it's actually more devastating as social critique or as a critique of the human condition than I had thought and before.
But you can't point to an individual and have that person put to trial because there's no name. The people are anonymous, and but they have control over the lives of other people.
Oh, yeah. And in a sense, it is kind of a model for the dictator, not to take this too far, but, you know, the dictator, this sort of godlike figure who suppresses everyone else in a way, and who is homicidal, murderous. And is there a homicidal, what would you, killing animals, predatory, let's just say that. Yeah, what an extraordinary work this is. I think we're reaching the point, but maybe I can get some help from our moderators for the Q&A. I don't want to.
Yes, we do have some questions coming in. This has just been so fascinating. So, no, wait a minute. We had a good question and then they retracted it. So let's see. The person was asking about Bambi as the Disney film. So two autumnalies conversing and pondering the hereafter as they prepare to fall from their tree. So did this moment come from the novel, and what was your interpretation? But so it does not seem like it.
Yeah, there's a chapter, a whole chapter, all of a sudden out of the blue. I forget which chapter. Wait 1 second. I can tell you. I think I marked it in my book. No, wait a sec. Yes. The leaves, it begins with, the leaves fell from the great oak tree at the edge of the meadow. They fell from all the trees. One branch of the oak tree stood high above the others and stretched far out toward the meadow. Two leaves sat together on its very tip. It's no longer like the old days, one leaf said to the other. You're right, responded the other leaf. And so it goes on. It's a brilliant chapter, very existentialist, and it appears out of nowhere, and it just sort of, you know, this is also one could call this book a greenie book because it's also about the environment. What do humans do to the environment, and what are our lives about? Philosophically, there's a lot to be mined from this book.
So somebody else is asking, did you discover how this book came to Disney's attention and why they chose to adapt it?
Yes. The book was published in English in 1928 that was a Whitney Chambers translation, and because of the Book of the Month Club, it was the Book of the Month Club in 1928. It sold a lot of copies, and then it subsided. And in about, I think it was 1930, there was an American filmmaker was in Austria and had known about the book, had known the translation, and approached Salten and said, would you mind giving me the complete rights to your novel? And Salten said, yeah, why not, for $1,000. And so he gave him $1,000. And then this director flew back to LA, and a couple of years later approached Disney and gave him the rights. I forget, I don't know what sum he was paid. And Disney was attracted to the novel because he liked animals. He had and how and why he was working at that time on his first animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So he had to finish his work on that film, which I think it came out in 1938. And then he was able to sort of turn his attention to some other projects he had. And by that time, I don't know whether he read the book in English and wanted to make his Disney sweetened version, or whether his artists and filmmakers decided to, transform the film completely from what it really was into this hideous, as I said, hideous, sweet work.
Yeah.
Jack, that makes me wonder, is Bambi a film that has traveled well? You mentioned Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Right.
It's as if everybody has seen that in the world.
Right.
But Bambi, I think of that as more of a film that was not a hit, but was widely viewed through the 70s, 80s, and obviously not so much anymore.
Yeah.
It's a film that everybody had seen, and I'm wondering, did it have much traction in other countries?
No, no, not in other countries, mainly in the UK and USA.
In the UK,
and also I would say that the film, was first filmed actually in 1942 in Switzerland. And he was there, Salten was there, his wife had died, he was very lonely, he was sort of old age, and he saw the film, and at the end of it, somebody asked him what he thought of the film, and he said it was very nice.
Damning with faint praise, yes.
Yes.
And it was, I think he was, who knows, I'm sure he must have been stunned when he saw the film.
Well, it was the cartoon version of the novel. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And yet, I think that Megan Cox Gordon points out that Disney sort of kept the novel alive. You might not have translated it had it not been for the Disney film. So some good would certainly come out of that. And
Disney has made billions of dollars from this, mainly on those little golden books and picture books, and it's never died out of the let us say the mind of people in the United States and elsewhere, because of that one scene that where the mother is killed. You don't do that. There have been arguments about whether in a film for children you should show that a mother gets killed and so on. In the meantime, the commercials in America are much more worse than anything that Disney ever tried to show with regard to killing and violence. I mean, everything is hypocrisy these days.
Here's a really interesting question coming in from Miriam Udell, who says that she's coming into this with an appreciation for both of you for your work on fairy tales, and especially the Brother Grimm, as well as her own immersion in Yiddish literature. And then she says, in German and Yiddish traditions, the forest is often a liminal space where the moral certainties of human habitations fall away. How would you characterize Salten's forest as a setting?
Definitely, I think that it's in the forest that anything can happen, and your ethics or your morality and so on will be defined by what you can do in where everything is level. Okay, so everybody has a chance. Even with the killings and fightings among the animals, generally speaking, everybody has a chance in the forest. Things are leveled. You can escape, as Bambi himself does, with the help of the prince and so on. So, but if you go outside the forest, life is prescribed, and you don't have a choice. You may think you have a choice. But from the minute you're born, you're prescribed to a certain way. You may break from that, but chances are you will grow up with a certain prescription.
Okay, yeah. We have another question here about if you can see any connection between Bambi's, the novel, and Jack London's Call of the Wild.
God, I love that, but I loved that when I was 12 or 13. I mean, Jack London was just a great writer. He was an inspiration, but I don't remember, to tell you the truth, I really don't recall. It's been 40, 50 years since I read that novel. Maybe Maria has something to say on that.
I think I can only repeat what you said. I read it many years ago, but I think it's a great term paper topic.
Yeah, comparing Bambi to Call of the Wild.
Actually, now I definitely want to reread it. You know, and you know, actually, you could think of a whole set of novels where, well, actually, Call of the Wild and Bambi are quite different in certain ways. But, you know, just thinking about novels in which you have just animal characters and how they function in allegorical terms, or whether they're used for satirical purposes. But that sort of opens things up. And also, as you were speaking, I thought about the whole question of utopia versus dystopia. And all these dystopic narratives that we have now. You know, you were talking about turning on the TV, and, you know, there are scenes of Hunger Games, for example, or, you know, any number of films and novels that come in its wake. So, yeah, I don't know whether, you know, the forest as a utopian space, but also a dystopic space as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a question that both of you can probably answer. Someone wants to know if they're new to this whole idea of reading fairy tales as an adult, where do you begin? Where do you start? So maybe you haven't done this since you were young. Where would you recommend an adult start to explore this as an area?
Maria, you started that.
Oh, well, oh gosh, I love the idea of just plunging in. You know, the thought of having a clean slate, a blank slate, because Jack and I have scribbled on our slate so much that, you know, it's almost as if we're going to give you too much information. And, but, you know, there's so much to read in terms of, you know, the numbers of collections of fairy tales, Fearless Women, where would you start, Jack? With in terms of criticism, I love Nancy Canepa's volume, Teaching Fairy Tales.
Yeah.
You can start with
That's a good place to start, actually.
Yeah, if you want criticism, but I would say, you know, diving in with Jack's translations of the Grimms, reading Anderson, and I think what I would do is go to a really good library and just browse the shelf and look at fairy tales globally, really, which is just what we're beginning. We used to, you know, we had this very narrow canon of European fairy tales, the Grimms, Anderson, a few Italians thrown in for good measure, Calvino's collection and Russian fairy tales.
Yes.
So it expanded out a little bit, but now Princeton has just published the Chinese fairy tale.
I was going to say that, yeah.
What a sensational, I was just knocked out. I mean, I almost fell off my chair as I was reading those. What a collection that is. And so yes, if you want more specifics, just email one of us and we'll give you a reading list. But I'm just so enthusiastic right now that I'm not giving you a very organized answer, and maybe Jack can do that.
No,
I like your suggestion of going to the library.
Right. You're a little prejudiced.
Yes. Nothing like browsing the shelf and finding things and being adventurous in the library.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's just one last question, and this must be from somebody who's familiar with you, because she says that she's reminded of other books Jack is translating. So it sounds like you must be translating others.
Yes.
And they're from the same basic time period. And they all seem oddly similar. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, yeah. I founded my own little publishing house called Little Mole and Honey Bear. And
Oh,
I've published about 5 or 6 different books, but these are books that were published, and I've edited them. They were published in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And my mission in my retired years is to bring these books back to life, because they are very talented, brilliant, both illustrators and also writers. And so I mentioned already Dorothy Burroughs, but there's a book that I did called a Little Mole and, no, I'm sorry, The Giant Owl and Tiny Tim by Christian Beermann, who's a forgotten painter, a book by Couturier, which deals with war, by the way, and how a rabbit shows a boy around the world where wars are happening and how fascist comes about. Another book is called Yusuf the Ostrich. It's about an ostrich in North Africa during World War II who saves the Allied forces by discovering the plans of the Nazis, and he's a fast runner and nobody can shoot him. And these are brilliant books that I'm delighting in my old age, redoing. And unfortunately, I don't have a great distribution, but the books are getting around. And my latest one is Tistu, the Boy with Green Thumbs, by a wonderful writer, Maurice Drouin, who's dead now, French. And it's all about this a boy who was born into a very wealthy family, and at 9 years discovers that his thumbs, once he touches anything, flowers grow, and he manages to prevent his father, who's an arms manufacturer, from selling his ammunition and bombs to other people, and he prevents a world war from happening. So we really need him right now. And these are books, I think, that are still relevant and keeps me going.
it's just wonderful. That's a great way to end the evening, I think. And thank you both so much, Maria and Jack, for coming on here. We have people just saying that, oh, someone's recommending to start with, I guess, Maria, you have a new edition of the classic fairy tales, which has a great selection of stories and versions from around the world, along with essays. So maybe that's a good place for people to start. And just that people are saying it's been a great and pleasant and interesting discussion, and I agree. And I'm so glad that we were able to host this here, and looking forward to the day when we can get back to doing some more in-person events. But thank you both for Zooming in with us tonight. And I'm going to close it off for now, and we'll see everybody later.
Great, thank you.
Great
Thank
to
you.
see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maria.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.